My name is Chuck Tatham. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Development at Densify. And with me today is James Feletra, Managing Director at ClearEdge, and an expert in IT procurement and IT infrastructure. Combined with my background in IT governance and infrastructure and optimization, we're going to present to you today on what we've titled Unraveling the Mysteries of Reserved Instances, Bridging the Gap Between DevOps and FinOps. We suspect this session has been very popular because of the reference to the mysteries of reserved instances. We're going to treat the complete topic of optimization of cost and performance in the cloud, because together with ClearEdge, we see this as something that is a best addressed as a holistic topic as it relates to management. And so we're going to cover an agenda today that will, of course, include introductions to our companies. But James is going to dive into, as an advisory and consulting firm in this space, what they see in trends in cloud spending, how infrastructure purchasing has changed in the cloud era. He's going to distill it to very simply three questions that matter, and that is what you're buying, how you buy it, and then how you control it over the long term to maintain an optimal state. I will then talk about Densify as a technology, enabling you to what I call buy the right stuff, tackle the RI challenge, which will be the majority of the content there, and then how you equip yourselves to do this systemically and over the long term. We'll summarize with a bit about where you can start, how you might tackle this challenge in your own organization, some thoughts there from both ClearEdge and Densify. And we will take questions at any point through the console. If you have a question on any of the slides, as we are in mute mode, you can log those questions at any time, and we'll cover those questions at the end of the session. And of course, we'll give you at the end information on where to find out more from an education perspective, or how to contact either company. So with that, let's dive in. If you haven't heard of Densify, we are a pure engine focused on machine learning and analytics to enable the automated matchmaking between application demand and infrastructure supply. And we refer to hybrid because it doesn't matter whether it's in public cloud in something like AWS EC2, in containers, or even on-prem in the form of VMware or containers. The whole point of Densify is to enable you with great confidence to drive more and more systemic optimization of your infrastructure. That is the essence of Densify. Our technology is proven in the largest organizations in the world. It's been reviewed by analysts, publications, and even our technology partners from a certifications perspective. Well-proven technology, a technology that you can trust. I'm going to hand the floor over to James now, and he's going to introduce ClearEdge and take you through his introductory thoughts on the topic. James?
Okay, great. Thanks, Chuck, for kicking this off. So as Chuck mentioned, I'm Jim Feletra, Managing Director here at ClearEdge, focused on cloud and managed services. Just a quick snapshot about ClearEdge, who we are if you haven't heard of us. We're a consulting firm headquartered in Boston with offices across the United States in some of the major cities. What we're not is an ISV or an SI or a VAR. Simply put, we really have an organization that assists clients directly in helping make proper decisions across the entire IT supply chain. So we like to coin the phrase, we really help you gain leverage. That's what we're about. That's where our focus is. So let's talk a little about why we're here today. What's the purpose for this discussion? Clearly, no secret that public cloud consumption is continuing to grow at just an incredibly rapid pace. If you think about now the amount of I think services that just are in Amazon alone, it's in the hundreds. And then if you consider the way in which organizations can provision into the cloud, that stretches into, I think, into the millions, which is an incredible statement in terms of what that brings from just complexity into provisioning and actually running workloads in the cloud. So we're seeing, obviously, this trend of organizations that are increasingly impacted with what that means from an ability to support the demand, and how does that correlate into what is acceptable at the business level. So lots of strains obviously being put on organizations. And if you think about it, a lot of that cloud-first strategy is really pushing the thought process that operations almost becomes an afterthought, right? So are the true costs then really known by the financial communities and the individuals that really have to track the spend? A lot of times what we witness at ClearEdge through discussions that we have with our customers is that these costs are just out of whack. I mean, I had a discussion with a CFO recently for an organization that I was doing some work for, and they said, look, we need help in this area. Cloud transformation is absolutely the rite of passage for us, and we recognize the need, but we're having just continual struggles on what that means just from a management standpoint on a month-to-month basis. So then you couple that with what's occurring on the ability to understand what the roles and responsibilities are doing with all this change, that shift and that stress that's occurring within the operational community, and the ways in which just organizations are even provisioning is changing dramatically, and the roles that organizations have within their communities are shifting. Think about infrastructure as a code, where provisioning is literally occurring through code change. That's a great example, right, of that shift. So now again, provisioning and control of things like adding storage or maybe a server instance becomes a spend event that may be executed by individuals possibly not operationally or financially focused. So why all the fuss, right, on the public cloud spending? Again, let's take it down to maybe the macro level of what used to be in place under the on-prem model. You'd have that kind of that 80-20 rule. 80%, I'd focus on my price. We'd get together on occasion during the course of the balance of the year, adjust the quantity levels. That 80-20 worked pretty well, right? But what's happened with the shift to the cloud, I apologize, there's a little delay on my screens here, is really it's almost flipped. It's become an event where, yeah, sure, price management is still important, but what's really driving the total cost of ownership within the on-prem model? It's almost become a game of Russian roulette that's highly focused on that calculation of future demand and usage patterns. So sure, price is still important, but think of, you know, just the variances in terms of those usage models and what they mean. So let's expand a little bit more into the cost influences on the cloud, right? You know, we look at hundreds of cases at ClearEdge on a monthly basis, and obviously the deals that are being executed in the cloud. Unfortunately, what we see on a pretty consistent basis is customers approaching this investment game with almost old world school model in place, where CapEx still becomes the discussion as what's king, and that that traditional approach to dealing with the cloud vendors will suffice if we just look at, can we maximize discounts in terms of our negotiation and strategy? What ways do we get to maximize credits, right? And can we review my T's and C's in a manner that protect those discounts and those credits, right? Not that those aren't important, sure they're important, but it only really addresses a subset of what's occurring in the cloud today. So just proving that point a little bit more with this shift back from that 80-20 rule, Just a little bit of information over the last few years that we've taken at ClearEdge and that we track that kind of proves out this point is that the amount of customers that we see entering into multi-year contractual commitments with AWS is increasing at a significant rate, those that are signing into EDPs. At that same time, there's the fact that the size of these commits is increasingly dramatically, right? So this speaks volumes to why traditional approaches to looking at why managing public cloud has to extend beyond the way of just looking at those maximizations of discounts and credits, right? And think about the observations backing up to the strategy announced even by AWS within their annual conference last year, that they are absolutely wanting to push you into an enterprise committed agreement, right? They want to push and grow those existing commits. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you've got to start to ask yourself the questions that do apply to the New World Order, right? Consider elements that were previously discussed, obviously, are on the left side of the screen, but there also has to be an increased consideration of the impact that this consumption-based model and this shift over to OpEx is having. So huge consequences on those buy decisions. So how do we get that better understanding of the annual commits? Does the organization have ways to understand usage in a, I say optimal manner, meaning almost at real-time demand, right? And can we begin to recognize ways to take advantage of reserved instances? For those maybe not familiar with the term, it's just a component of infrastructure that you can put terms in place for a better potential price, right? Where you may want to be, but what are the ramifications of those decisions, right? Based upon, again, having an accurate read on what your usage model should be and what your forecast may be. So again, the public cloud, it's leading us from that traditional CapEx-based model to a much more highly focused one that's on consumption and an OpEx driven. So that changing landscape is really what constitutes a lot of that success when you look at kind of the combination of the old and the new. So to summarize it a bit and try to put it into kind of a reality of today's public cloud, it's depicted here from, this is information from Densify through some recent surveys of customers they had, as well as some of our analysis at ClearEdge, is clearly we're seeing this rapid speed and movement to the public cloud, creating all sorts of potential ROI mismatches. Because organizations are starting to realize that their investments in what they're buying don't necessarily produce the expected results as quickly as they had thought, right? You'll hear it all the time. You know, I'm in the cloud. Geez, I thought some of the cost savings, I would have witnessed them quicker. You know, what's the result of that? Well, it's struggling to figure out how to capture that proper information, right, to then make those decisions as what's occurring within the spend model. And then clearly that the services sometimes aren't matching the needs of the applications, right? Management tools not necessarily given the proper level of information regarding even some of the, you know, the table stakes around billing change, right, and things for, that have to do with the capacity in the cloud. So that result is clearly complexity and constant change within your operational model and your finance model. And that's being depicted through what we see with clients today. So I know Chuck had mentioned, we really have started to boil this down to really three fundamental questions that all organizations should be asking themselves as they go through this journey to the cloud. We choose them the correct product for the workload. So what brought you to that decision that was associated with the supplier and the actual SKU that you've chosen? And how did you determine that correct way to pay for the workload? So reserved instances are clearly a way to increase savings. And this is something that we're going to dive much deeper into as the webinar progresses, and Chuck will get into a lot of specifics about this. But do you have access to that appropriate level of information really to make that decision and to make that proper decision around whether you stay with a pay-as-you-go model or you decide to work with reserved instances? And then lastly, do you understand what will be required to control the future provisioning and the purchasing? So, that understanding of the changing landscape and the ways to optimize, how are people provisioning, and what are the controls and governance procedures that you have in place? So providing those answers and an approach to these questions, that's where we really want to focus the majority of the time remaining. So I'm going to turn it back over to Chuck now to show you a little bit more on the technology side of ways that you can have influence on that.
Thanks, James.
Yep.
I'd like to start the next part of the presentation asking you to think about key roles in the consumption of cloud and the potential mismatch of interests in those roles and with those responsibilities. And by that, we point out that cloud engineering and operations and app owners often where cloud consumption and innovation begins, often think about that consumption very, very differently than those that are concerned with the costs. From a application experience perspective and from an innovation and speed to market perspective, performance and agility will always come first. And so we use this simplistic chart to show the importance of performance as it relates to cost. Cost, people are aware of it, but it's really in the periphery to doing what needs to get done. Finance is almost the opposite. Those that are concerned with budgets and governance and control will always worry about cost first. They know performance is important, but it's in these differences where we see the potential for escalating challenges, and that is that those that are concerned with performance and agility first now have instant and unlimited availability of capacity. The ability to spin up a new server, spin up multiples of new servers, the ability to supersize something, go for a large because that's what I used last time and it worked well. Nobody's going to bug me if my stuff runs well. So there's a distinct bias there toward that kind of consumption. And then conversely, those that concern themselves with finance don't have those events, those large purchases of hardware, those vendor negotiations like they used to James' point, the old versus the new. So the differences here create an interesting tension. And if you think about how these decisions are made, they're often within a chain of development and delivery of functionality that is deployed into these hosting platforms. Yes, there may be change management in play because everyone generally observes that you need to control change and manage it, but the expectation is that we go faster and faster today. If you're a cell phone user and you're dealing with your bank, that app is updated sometimes daily. The speed is crazy, so you have to obviously have change management, but the selection of the resource, the decision of how much capacity or resource to give something is really being driven by individuals that aren't doing bad things intentionally, or you might not even call it bad, but they're generally left to estimate or guess. And so this dynamic is creating an escalation of cost. We'll go further to suggest to you that, and James touched on this, that a trend toward infrastructure as code is embedding the problem right into the systems, so to speak, where if a customer or a company is using Terraform or AWS CloudFormation, if you're not using these technologies today in the cloud, you very, very soon will be, because they allow you to specify the infrastructure as part of code. And it's becoming more and more difficult to separate the software, the application, from the actual infrastructure. They become almost one and the same. And we like to say this sends a chill down the spine of finance organizations, we call it purchasing as code. It is the purchasing action right in the code. So it's important to think about this as the way modern infrastructure and modern applications are provisioned into the cloud. And it's a dynamic when coupled with the motivations or the interests of people that are driving situations like this. A large bricks and mortar retailer transitioning to online, line of business doing as it should, monthly budget set at an aggressive 100,000 a month, DevOps moving very quickly, and that infrastructure resource provisioning intermingled with the development process is creating a cloud spend that is wildly out of sync with the budget, and the company caught between innovation and speed and cost realities. So you can't rein in costs by throwing a whole bunch of governance at it, because you will impede agility. And so this is the balance of the challenge that many are experiencing. So back to James's original questions, are we choosing the correct product for the workload? How would you do that in a way that doesn't burden the human with it and turns it into something scientifically derived? And so if we're going to do that, what are the critical inputs into making that right resource selection? Well, you need to understand deeply the application demand patterns. How are those apps consuming resources? How will they consume them into the future? What can we learn from the behavior of the workloads to predict the future? A deep understanding of the workload is important. You then have to understand all of the capabilities, the costs, the performance specifications, and the technical constraints involved in placing those applications or workloads into the hosting venues. Whether it's on your own hardware or into something that AWS released last week, those are wildly different with respect to capabilities, cost, etc. You may have business constraints and governance rules that will impact your decisions. And of course, you can't treat production critical workloads the same way as you would a dev test workload, or vice versa, because that is going to underserve or potentially overserve that workload. And so Densify, our entire business, is around building an engine that's capable of learning from the application demand patterns, receiving all of these inputs, and driving out answers that are very precise with respect to the optimal resource specifications. These aren't guesses, these are empirically derived answers that will help you align when you might be, let's say, already in the cloud. And we use a Tetris block to indicate a workload and a dotted line to represent what you've purchased. But I'm already in cloud. Am I hurting a workload because I'm not provisioning enough or the right personality match to service that workload, or am I over-serving it? In the case of instances where you control your capacity, bare metal and VMware is a great example, but containers, Kubernetes in the cloud, an excellent example of where if you place workloads in compatible ways, you can drive greater density. How might I do that? And then the third might be, I'm running in one venue. How could I treat that workload if I moved it somewhere else? What would I procure to move, let's say, a workload on-prem to containerized in AWS so that I'm performing but not over-serving? So Densify is exceptionally good at doing this matchmaking, which means you can not leave it to humans to guess or to try to figure it out themselves. And so when we derive our answers, it's all about the right performance, the best stability at the right cost or cost appropriate. If we look at something like instance resource optimization, I'm already in the cloud. What might I do to my workloads to ensure that I please my app owners, I please the line of business, my end customers, ensuring that they're in the right family, that they're in the most modern instance of the family they're in, that they're getting enough resource? And how do I do that in such a way that I'm not spending a penny more than I need to in servicing that workload? That, of course, cascades into things like scale groups, the coming wave of container resourcing, the reservations, the limits, the initial values, those sorts of things are all empirically derivable. You don't have to leave it to humans to come up with the answer. So buying the right stuff requires balanced resource selection strategies. And if you've bought the right stuff, then you can start to think about what my purchasing strategies might be. Because I've now got performant applications on the right infrastructure, the ops, engineering, and app owners are happy, and I'm doing it at an appropriate point that my bills are in line, and finance is happy. So let's move on to question number 2, which is, okay, I've now equipped myself with the right kind of capacity. What can I do now to get my costs down further? And as James said, and as your friendly AWS representatives will tell you, RIs and making commitments are the best way to reduce that cost. And it makes a ton of sense. If you make that commitment, that gives them business predictability, and it makes sense for everyone. But it's not always that simple. If we talk about the RI challenge, they're very powerful instruments. Done well, you can save a huge amount over on demand. In fact, you might argue that nothing that you run should be without a reserved instance. But the cloud providers give you a ton of options and really only basic guidance around how to optimize them. And it's not surprising, I guess, in a sense, but they've given you lots of options so that you can have all the knobs and dials you need to do this. But unless you're managing it as an active portfolio, you will have suboptimal outcomes. It's just a fact, because it requires a constant and cyclical process in order to optimize. And we're going to walk through why that is. But this is generally the challenge around RIs. Everyone wants to use them. It is absolutely the cheapest way to buy. But to optimize against the strategy is very difficult. Jim,
Hey,
you have a comment? Yep.
Yeah, Chuck, just a real quick comment. So, reminds me, looking at this slide, we were working with a company recently, large spend in AWS and a significant future development in place that they were trying to figure in terms of where they were going. And I had a individual just say to me that, we're going to just make a big investment in RIs and save a boatload of money. And it was clear to me that none of what you've positioned in terms of optimization and guarantees around how they were going to manage that portfolio were in place. So this is real activity that's occurring that we're witnessing in terms of the way organizations are dealing with demand. We're seeing it constantly within our own community in terms of the cases we're looking at.
A great example and a timely transition to talk about strategies and what might be optimal with respect to reserved instances. When workloads are stable and predictable, that is putting you in a position to confidently make a commitment to a standard RI, and you may be, depending on cash flow, going to pay for it all up front to get the absolute optimal discount. The issue is, though, that there's so much change, not necessarily within, let's say, your workload demand, but change in the way the providers serve up the capacity, the way they productize it, what they make available. And if you make a long-term commitment, it's almost like buying a physical server. And so it's often a good consideration to hedge with convertibles just because of the amount of change, not your own change, but even the change with respect to way things are provided. Now, when you've got variability or unpredictable workloads, convertible RIs give you great flexibility, but of course you pay a bit more for that to have that flexibility. But it is not a buy it and forget it proposition, because if you have that convertibility and you pay for that privilege, you need to be able to flex that right. And buying and managing annually is generally not enough. It creates large chunks of things that have to be decisioned at once. If you do it infrequently, you will often have big decisions to make all at once. And so a high frequency of purchasing and exchanges and optimization is really required to get access to the full benefit. It increases the odds of getting to full coverage. But the optimal answer as it relates to conversions and exchanges is constantly changing with the passage of time. So you need quick answers, timely answers, and you need to be able to execute them. And so it's very difficult to do manually. In fact, just like doing the optimal purchase, doing the optimal exchange really defies human ability. And it pushes people into periodic or inefficient strategies. And so inputs to optimization of purchasing strategies around RIs, let's examine those inputs. You have to start, of course, by understanding what you own already, what you're running. You have to understand what you own as far as your RI portfolio. Of course, you need to be aware of all the various shapes, sizes, and types, and configurations, and zones, and terms that represent RI purchases. And if you want a bit of a mind warp, go up and start reading the rules, and I'll call them regulations, around what you can and can't do across different regions or types, the costs, the true-up costs associated with making changes. So the rules are very complex. And you can kind of see where this is going. If you have an engine or a brain that can do the combinations and permutations, you can derive very precise changes. And so what Densify will do with our RI optimization strategies and capabilities is give you very precise changes, just like we did on the purchasing side of, or rather the provisioning side of the resources. This is on the RI side. We will give you insight into the very detailed exchanges, any additional purchases required, whether you should be expiring some, and of course, coming out of all these combinations and the optimal choices would be the changes, of course, in what you own. And the changing nature of what you're actually running means that this has to be a cyclical process, one where you have the visibility to understand where you stand, the analytics to derive the optimal match with all of these things considered, and then the very precise recommended actions to go and continually optimize the matchmaking of actual demand and those RIs. And so if we drill into the topic of visibility for a moment, we'll show you the inventory of what you own, how utilized you are. We'll show you which departments have purchased and which are using, because those aren't always the same. The coverage percentage, whether you're over or under subscribed, as well as even historical views of purchases and exchanges. So visibility really sets you up to understand where you are at any point with respect to your RI strategies. Just a couple of screenshots showing chart-based outputs. This is percentage coverage in hours. We can drive out tabular information, the ability to download and export to Excel if it's desired, summary, by month, your percent utilization of RIs. So visibility is about establishing an understanding of where you are. And then the analytics-driven recommendations around changes are the deep detail around the actions you should take to improve the state of your portfolio, including the net true-up costs and the final overall savings. It's going to factor in those complex rules and the associated costs of making those changes. And we're using under the covers some innovative strategies to drastically reduce true-up costs to, and we'll show you an example of this, inconsequential levels. Because if you take a very rough or macro approach to this, you can end up with savings, but you can end up with very large true-up costs, and we'll come back to that. further recommendations around additional RIs that you can't get to through exchanges, or even identification of non-convertible RIs that can just be left to expire. This is a beta of our user interface shipping in Q1, showing you, in this case, 3 exchange sets with a summary and a bit of detail of the true-up costs and the monthly savings. But if we drill into this, under the covers are all the line items, the details of that portfolio improvement set of actions. Now, how you go and action these might involve actually having discussions with AWS, but in the near future, through AWS APIs, we will be able to action these so that you're constantly running the recommended actions back to the infrastructure, realizing the change, and seeing that impact immediately. And this should be contrasted with, manually derived answers that, you're waiting for people to execute, or perhaps AWS to help you execute, because every day that marches by, once you've derived a set of answers, those answers become incomplete or incorrect because the value of those RIs are constantly changing. So it's not only important to be able to derive the answers efficiently and get the answers quickly, but also to be able to drive those to action quickly and reasonably. The customer case example, a large ISV spending very significantly in the cloud, and they had a problem with underused convertible RIs. They adopted the strategy, but they found over time the process was just too complex, calculating it, figuring them out, and then actually working with AWS to get the exchanges done. Leveraging some AWS provided recommendations, because they do some of this as part of managing your account, we're actually suggesting savings, but the actual true-up costs were big enough to require financial approvals, thereby inserting delay, which would then, of course, make those recommendations incorrect. And so by driving a process through Densify for a single business unit, we derived very, very quickly almost 60K a month save, or almost 700,000 annually, with a true-up cost of $240. And I, note the decimal place there. It's a fact that if you drive these strategies effectively and you can do the matchmaking and execute on them, the savings can be very significant and the effort very, very small. So just an example of that. Now, transitioning now away from RIs, we'll come back to the topic in summary. But the third is, how are we controlling future provisioning of workloads? How are we going to do this on an ongoing basis? Well, simply by embedding this kind of technology in the workflow, you can deal with both sides of this equation just as a way of part of running. And so if we peer into this, this is a dashboard showing a Densify summary of all of the detail changes below that are being recommended to improve this particular infrastructure. If we drill into one of these changes, here we're showing an M4 large on demand, and we're suggesting it should be an R5A large, and it could be or should be a reserved instance, all of the science below it. The challenge with getting this done is back to those different personas that we introduced and the different interests. So Densify, for every answer we produce, provides a human readable app owner report that goes to an app owner that hopefully encourages them to approve a change because they're comfortable with the proof we've provided. The second piece is what we call machine readable, which is the ability for ops and engineering to take that quality answer and integrate it into the process of managing the infrastructure. And if we look into that app owner report, what you'll see here is the ability to very quickly understand in blue how I've behaved historically inside what I own. The green is the machine learned predicted model of what that workload will look like in the future. And the far right is the financial model around the before and after. This preconditions the app owner to allow that change to happen. If we go back to the infrastructure as code example, where we in the introduction showed someone hard coding, give me a large, we enable an organization to simply variabilize that. So to say, give the developer their default, but as Densify learns about the workload and has a better answer, we go from hard-coded guess or estimation to what we call self-optimizing. And so it's a couple lines of code that allows that infrastructure as code to receive the optimized answer from Densify. And if you consider that in an overall tool chain, and this is a simple one, what we're talking about is, in this case, AWS CloudFormation specifying resources and provisioning infrastructure, Densify watching over it, learning from those patterns, and producing that human-readable output and the machine-readable companion, which informs the app owner and can be picked up as part of the build, the patch, or the next deployment of that piece of infrastructure and software, abiding by approval actions if needed, to make this part of just the cycle of managing. So this is an example of a DevOps chain. We call it CICDCO for continuous optimization. We've recently introduced a very cool integration with Slack that allows us to push those app owner reports and even the recommendation and the approval control into a teaming environment and collaboration environment, which makes it, again, one step closer to the people that actually control infrastructure to get that optimization happening. So as we summarize the content today, we thought we should talk a little bit about, where might you start as you think about the three questions that James introduced and we've addressed in the content. And I'll come back to these personas and their individual interests. You might start on the side of the equation that is automating the matchmaking between infrastructure demand and infrastructure supply, getting workloads just constantly into the right instance types and the right amount of resource. That has a very obvious effect of ensuring that you're always buying the right stuff, that stuff is always performing, and that it's always getting the right resources. You might consider starting on the finance side, the way you're procuring, because no matter what you're running today, effective management of reserved instances, properly applying and managing exchanges and convertible RIs can have a very significant impact without touching infrastructure, without concerning yourself with the left side of this equation. But to deal with it comprehensively, you really have to deal with both sides. You might start on one or the other, but what you put your workloads into as you provision will have a direct impact on what you commit to over time. What you don't want to do is treat the cloud like bare metal infrastructure and end up with, in essence, data centers, virtual data centers full of capacity that you're just not using properly. So we would recommend, both ClearEdge and Densify, that you treat this topic holistically, because it's only when you deal with both sides of the equation do you deal with the complete challenge. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to James to talk for a moment about how they engage around these kinds of challenges. James?
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. To kind of maybe segue off that last slide, I mean, clearly we recognize that I think tech impacts finance and finance impacts tech more than ever. And I truly believe that, the organizations that we see having the most success are the ones that recognize, honestly, sometimes you really have to just take a step back and understand the way that you're governing and looking at what constitutes success when moving into the cloud. That often really can be recognizing that there is a need sometimes to put ownership and have people understand what their roles are within these type of changes. And clearly it does start, I believe, with that cross-functional alignment between business and IT and operations to understand really how far along you are in a model that provides you the ability or creates a structure to understand what you need to be successful. You know, do you have the proper places and processes and control? We talked a little bit, and clearly I think Chuck exemplified the issue around infrastructure as code. That clearly is a good thing if it's taken advantage of in terms of the way you want to orchestrate within the cloud. And there's a clear understanding that cross-functional alignment of what that means to demand and usage and the financial decisions that come from it. So, you know, do you know the services that you selected are the best choice for that application? Again, back to the way that you're governing. So, you know, taking into consideration, making sure that you have an ability to document and analyze and have the proper technologies like Densify in place to help you make those recommendations and take actionable execution strategies into consideration for the future, we believe are critical. Whether you hire an organization like ClearEdge, we do a lot of that work through assessment work, or not, it's something that you have to focus on. You know, organizations that are spending more money in the cloud than they need to today have to address, like Chuck pointed out on that previous slide, both the technical and the financial side. And the best way to do that is through that cross alignment, right? Make sure that you're honest about what those decisions breed then in terms of what has to change.
Thanks, James. With respect to starting with something like Densify and beginning a path to more automated optimization of both the matchmaking and the buying, we generally prescribe a path of maturing with the analytics that can start with just the basics of visibility. In about 30 minutes, we can stand up and begin collecting data. We're a SaaS-based solution, so it happens very, very quickly. It's all done through APIs. There's nothing to deploy into the infrastructure. And that visibility enables both a view of how well or efficiently you're consuming resources with your workloads today, and with respect to your purchasing strategies, what might be lurking as far as potential in improving that portfolio management. Oftentimes, customers would then graduate to applying some of what's learned and getting some quick wins around taking action on those resource optimization recommendations, showing app owners and the business that the lights are still on, that applications are performing, and beginning to take action on cleaning up or remediating anything that's suboptimal in the RI portfolio. You then might go more broadly and integrate to ITSM. Notice we haven't talked at all about as code or automating change. What we're doing first is getting the right answers into the right hands and making better decisions. An ITSM integration like a ServiceNow or a Jira might allow you to then start taking those changes and pushing them through, you know, more specific change management. And then at some point, and every customer is different, you graduate toward a closed loop automation process that, you know, builds on that ITSM integration, but might start to factor in things such as a Terraform, a Hashi, Terraform, a CloudFormation, Red Hat Ansible, those sorts of things, to embed it in the tool chains that you're using to provision new workload into the cloud. And that's sort of the end game. But the whole point is to go from old school manual process that's time consuming and really hard for people to do effectively toward automated cloud resource management, or as containers enter the picture, container resource management. I'll point out that that phase one can really begin with a no-cost trial. It's a very rapid to stand up process where you actually see your own data reflected through this kind of lens. So it's an attractive way to start, and one where we begin you on this path toward a greater sophistication in the way you manage. I should add, as it relates to that, it's just as relevant in an organization that's just getting going. Maybe you have a cloud-first strategy, but you're largely in physical data centers today, and you want to do it right the first time. Avoid that, the errors of just lifting and shifting and those sorts of things. You might be, well into the cloud like some of our customers and just starting to be startled by the cost, and you want to do a bit of remediation and sort of get control and then continue forward. So there's no wrong point of starting, depending where you are in your journey. And with that, I'd like to thank James for his contributions today. We have a few minutes left for questions. There's some contact information and some upcoming demonstrations you might want to register for. Unfortunately, these aren't clickable URLs, but they're pretty simple if you note them down. Contact information for Jim and for myself, as well as the links on densify.com to get demos. And if you have questions, we'd be happy to field them again through the questions console. Jim, I have a question that's probably directed more toward you, around company just beginning cloud journey, deployments in place, minimal in nature for dev test. But do you have some suggestions on how we might make our journey more effective?
Well, yes, certainly I would suggest, just thinking back to some of the things that we talked about today, that it's clearly okay to walk before you run, so to speak. That you've got to consider some of those same practices that gave you success in the on-prem world are being followed and considered when you're addressing all these complex and rapid fire changes and provisioning at large scale and movements into the cloud. Chuck, actually, like you show on your path to success and where do you start? You can start with visibility and recognize if you have something in place today where those quick hits might be.
Sure.
So, those are things that you've got to consider. Proper structure is in place, proper governance, and don't feel threatened by, slowing it down sometimes and making sure that you've got that proper model in place before you move quickly to it.
Good point. A question on the technologies. Does Densify work for multi-account, single-payer structures? Yes, we support all the typical combinations of accounts and structures. It's an interesting question. Have you started seeing movement or conversations around being able to capitalize dedicated hosting environments in a private cloud versus increasing OpEx through hosting in a public cloud? James, that's probably a great question for you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, clearly there's a lot of that we're seeing, organizations that are leveraging both in the demand and obviously wanting to recognize the reality that we are in a hybrid model and we're going to stay in one for quite some time, if not forever, right? But the varying degrees of that success, you have to consider things like, the orchestration capabilities really in where your resource maturity may lie. Again, those are some of the things that we've talked about today. Having those proper controls and governance models in place are critical.
Yeah, and from our perspective, because we our analytics work in a VMware environment and bare metal on-prem, right up to containers in the cloud. And to give yourself a chance of being favorably comparable from a cost perspective on-prem, you have to drive density. Thus the name Densify. So we give you the best possible chance at having a positive comparison there. Another question, are we able to do AWS, Azure, and GCP under one account? Yes, a single deployment of Densify covers, you can have all of the technologies and types of capacity we mentioned under the same user experience, even to the point of having the right terminology for the right type of environment. I will point out, though, that we are most advanced on AWS with respect to our analytics. Our roadmap is advancing on a weekly basis. Actually, our deployed code is advancing on almost a weekly basis. So we're marching Azure and GCP support along very quickly. A question on what is the lowest, I'm assuming what this person is asking, what the lowest monthly budget of a typical customer would be. Sometimes we're asked, what do you have to be spending for a Densify investment to make sense? Generally, we are most applicable when you're spending $1 million or more in public cloud. That would be a guidepost that we would allows us to show tremendous value. So hopefully that answers the question. Just take one last question. Do RI recommendations take utilization into account to avoid making a commitment to inappropriate resources? I assume so, but I didn't hear anything regarding a strategy to get EC2 right sizing to a reasonable place. That's a beautiful question, and one that is absolutely supporting that two-sided equation. Buy the right stuff by empirically matching the nature of your workloads into the right instance types, the right instance family, and the right amount of resource. Then you're buying the right stuff. Then think about your commitment, and that is the way to get that double effect of optimization. Those are great questions. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for attending and staying throughout. I encourage you to reach out to us if you'd like a demo or you'd like to talk to ClearEdge about some of the organizational and planning sides of equipping yourself with better strategies. We'd love to talk to you more. Thank you all for your time and have a great day.